Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm James Patrick. I flew to Chile to interview Whitney Webb. She has done extensive journalistic work into CBDCs, digital IDs, tokenization of financial assets, and natural asset companies. This interview was shot as a part of the making of the documentary film CBDCs, The End of Money.
My name is Whitney Webb. I'm the contributing editor to Unlimited Hangout and have been an investigative journalist and researcher for about 8 years and previously worked for Mint Press News as their senior investigative reporter. There's a coordinated global policy push for digital IDs as the new form of government-issued identification credentials. And they're essentially all based on your biometric data, which can be your fingerprints, your face, the iris of your eyeball. And the idea is essentially to collect all of that data and have it housed or have it tied directly to your digital ID. So your physical ID will be mapped to the digital ID. Digital IDs are not really a separate project from CBDCs and this new digital financial system. And UN documentation and also documentation from the Bank of International Settlements, they very overtly state that CBDCs and digital IDs are meant to go together. And without digital IDs, the CBDC digital finance system cannot exist. One of the reasons it can't exist without that is because of the KYC functionality built into this digital financial system. They have the know your customer protocols. They have to know who you are. And so they want to have your wallet tied to a digital ID and have that digital ID be mapped to your physical ID through the biometric data collection. So there's different efforts to make digital IDs either as NFTs, non-fungible tokens. There's also the efforts of Sam Altman of OpenAI and his WorldCoin project, whereby you scan your iris, you give them the biometric credentials of your eyeball. They give you a unique identifier, a digital ID, and it's inherently tied to a digital wallet. That is the same model the UN is using. They've already implemented it for refugees getting food assistance from the World Food Program. It's called Building Blocks. It's on blockchain. It involves refugees scanning their irises, and in order to buy food or receive their rations, they have to check out of a grocery store style place in the refugee camp, and they check out biometrically with an eyeball scan, and then the amount of food they have, the monetary value of that is subtracted from their digital wallet connected to their digital ID and their iris. It doesn't matter what country you're in or whether you're part of BRICS or part of the collective West. This is being rolled out across the board.
So what entities are pushing this interoperability?
One of the main reasons for this coordinated global push to develop digital IDs is because it's deemed essential to the entire Sustainable Development Agenda, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, also known as Agenda 2030. And the specific part dealing with digital IDs is within SDG 16, which is about building peaceful and inclusive societies. One of the indicators of SDG 16, 16.9, calls for legal identification for everyone in the world from the time they're born, essentially. The leading alliance that was launched under the auspices of the UN to accomplish that is known as ID 2020 and has since been folded into what is called the Digital Impact Alliance, which essentially has the same funders and founders as ID 2020. So ID 2020, the UN and other stakeholders in this particular sphere often argue that the reason this is necessary is because of what they call the identity gap. And the identity gap is the claim that the lack of digital ID is preventing people, mainly the world's poor, from accessing essential services, whether it's banking, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare. They claim the only way for these people to be able to access these services is to onboard them to these identity schemes. So what they mean by essential services is, they say without these forms of recognized identity, people in the world, mainly the world's poor, are unable to access bank accounts, unable to access healthcare, unable to access government services, a variety of things, because they don't have ID or they don't have bank accounts, things of that nature. So in order to allow everyone to access all of these things and include them, hence the frequent word of inclusion in all these documents, they say digital ID is the necessary way to bridge this identity gap.
Do you find those arguments credible, or?
One of the main words they use to market this stuff is equity and inclusion. The idea that we need to include everybody in these new systems. But if you don't participate in digital ID, you won't have a legally recognized identity, you won't have rights, you won't be able to access services without it. So it's being framed as promoting inclusion, but the system itself is inherently exclusionary and has been used to track and surveil people, to link people to, essentially all their activities, what they say online in some of the countries that have rolled this out, and has been used to facilitate human rights abuses. So it's not exactly as inclusive as they like to claim. It's inclusive in the sense that we want everyone equally included in our new system that we're creating, our new control system, fundamentally. The UN likes to talk about human rights and how this is ultimately a human rights project and things like that, or how it's empowering human rights. But in other documents of the UN, they refer to human rights not as inalienable rights, which is what most people think of when they hear the term human rights. In some of these UN documents, they refer to human rights explicitly as policy tools, or tools that can be used to basically implement, specific things and mechanisms that ultimately give, greater control over really any aspect of your life that they may want to influence. These guys also admit that the digital ID and CBDC is meant to be the same thing, and there's some very illuminating policy documents in this regard. So for example, there's this one UN document called the People's Money, they call it, and it essentially talks about creating a citizen-centric, SDG-aligned digital financial system, which is obviously the system that we've been talking about. And what they say in there is essentially once your savings and your money is onboarded onto the system, they feel that they reserve the right to access and use your funds to develop and implement the Sustainable Development Goals or build the infrastructure necessary for it. So they essentially think that your money is their money. When COVID was happening, there was this push for vaccine passports, and a lot of the people that were pushing or creating the vaccine passports were part of this either ID 2020 or they were part of related entities pushing for digital ID. And essentially what happened with the vaccine passport was to link your identity to your travel, to the freedom of movement. And if you didn't have one, you were excluded from entering certain places. So that, again, highlights the idea of how these digital IDs are inherently exclusionary, because if you don't have one, then you're excluded from, moving where other people that have those privileges. And if you don't abide by these various stipulations, you're excluded from participating in those things. And if you look at how the UN sponsored groups like ID 2020 are constructing this, they're trying to hide behind a facade of decentralization and construct digital identity in a way that they call as vendor agnostic, meaning that any private company in theory could develop a digital ID system that people could use. So you'll have a variety of companies or government agencies issuing digital ID, and it will not look like a centralized digital ID, but it will be. Based on what's been developed so far by these entities, it seems like that database is meant to be housed at the World Bank, and it's called ID4D, and is sort of cloaked in the same rhetoric that ID 2020, cloaks their own project, claiming it's decentralized and all of this, but it's a centralized global data set where all these different digital ID systems can export their data to. The World Bank's interesting in the sense that, the World Bank, the IMF, they essentially use a debt slavery model to enforce policy objectives on national governments. And the World Bank has openly said that debt is a critical form of financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically saddle a country in debt, and instead of having it enact austerity policies and things like that, it's to get them to enact digital ID. It's to get them to enact, financial inclusion, as they call it, with the CBDCs and their public-private sector equivalents, things of that nature. So that's how they force nation states to act as these enabling environments for these policies. A lot of it is through debt slavery, essentially.
And then governments are sort of just voluntarily following all that.
The UN very openly views the role of national governments only as enabling environments for these policies. So the national governments aren't meant to develop these policies themselves. They're meant to enforce these policies developed by the UN and their stakeholder partners, groups like the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then enforce those policies on the public. So a lot of people view the UN sort of as a meeting of the different public sectors and governments of the world, but even the UN leadership have admitted that since at least in the 1990s, if not earlier, there was what Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, called a quiet revolution at the UN, where the business of the UN became the businesses of the world. And there was this move away from the public sector to having it emphasize public-private partnership, which is why you have the premier promoter globally of public-private partnerships, the World Economic Forum, being one of the main strategic partners currently of the United Nations. And this isn't free market capitalism, it's crony capitalism, it's cartelism, because these are, fundamentally corrupt players that don't play by the rules. They manipulate the free market to advance themselves and generate more money and become more powerful. And so really this is, a merging of the public and the private sector, but it's the private ones in control and they operate as a cartel, not as free market capitalists. And that's essentially where we are right now. And this was essentially admitted before Congress by a very prominent figure at the time named Samuel Pisar, who is probably best known now as being the stepfather of current Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And when he testified before Congress, he talked about the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation, where essentially Western capitalists, or a group of them, had decided to cooperate and do business rather with the people that ran state-owned enterprises in the communist bloc, and together build a network of corporations essentially that would become so powerful that they would make the nation state irrelevant. And this is essentially the model we have today.
These policies would include like the CBDCs, the SDGs, and the digital IDs? Or?
Yeah, so a lot of these policies are folded into the UN Sustainable Development Agenda or the Digital ID Agenda, and there's different think tanks and different entities that push for these things, but one of the overarching ways this is being forced on the national governments is the Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs, which essentially every country in the world has signed on to implement, and even countries that are supposedly against, the West, for example, the adversaries of the West like Russia and China, have issued joint statements about how they agree about Agenda 2030 and the need to implement these things, while the West, the EU, the Biden administration all also agree about those things. It's a global agreement that these particular policies need to be implemented at the global level. I think there's a lot of growing awareness that the UN as the global superpower is problematic for a variety of reasons. But the same people that ensured the creation of the US as this superpower in the post-World War II era are also behind the creation of this multipolar world order that is also being, currently created right now. So after World War II, there was the Bretton Woods situation, which helped ensure U.S. financial hegemony around the world. And currently, we have what a lot of these same actors are calling the new Bretton Woods moment that needs to be seized in order to create a new global financial governance system. And they inherently frame that new system as being multipolar in nature. So just like digital IDs are inherently exclusionary and being sold as a tool for inclusion, CBDCs and also digital IDs are being framed as decentralized when in reality they're very centralized. So in the case of digital IDs, there's this push to create decentralized IDs, they call it, where your credentials are only unencrypted on a need-to-know basis. And, that sounds great in practice, but in reality, these rely on what they call trusted third parties to verify those credentials. And those are the same government agencies and big banks and other entities that are those same trusted third parties. So it's really not as decentralized as a lot of their proponents would like to claim. When you move into this digital currency era where the banks are issuing these stable coins, these deposit tokens that are programmable money, it's not just programmable, they're going to be sharing this data in the same database that the CIA and any other intelligence agency can access whenever they want without a warrant. This is like baking in warrantless spying on Americans into the new system to come. So there's no more Congress needing to pass, the laws that facilitate FISA warrants and stuff like that have sort of been the existing infrastructure to institutionalize warrantless spying on Americans. This is a way to literally make it a part of the infrastructure from the get-go. No more secret FISA courts, or you don't need any of that infrastructure anymore. It is the new system.
And then, so can you explain the CBDC two-tier model?
Yeah, so much of the public rhetoric on CBDCs by those that claim to oppose it is really about retail CBDC, which means that it's a CBDC that the public interacts with directly, whereby, for example, a central bank would directly issue a CBDC, and then that's the currency that the people would be using in wallets that are managed by the central bank. Retail CBDC is not nearly as common today as wholesale CBDC. And wholesale CBDC works as this two-tier system. So in this two-tier system, one of the tiers, the tier that involves the CBDC, is between the central bank and financial institutions, whereby the CBDC really only serves as a means of interbank settlement and isn't public-facing at all. And so the second tier there is the private banks, the financial institutions are issuing the money that actual people use, but all the interbank settlement is being done in a CBDC. And this is the model that's set to be followed in the United States. Because FedNow, for example, of the Federal Reserve, that was launched solely as a means of interbank settlement, really. It's not meant to interact with the public at all, and the Federal Reserve has been very open about that, so that FedNow is essentially the infrastructure for a wholesale CBDC model, not a retail CBDC model. So when you have people like Trump and Ron DeSantis say no CBDC, they mean no public-facing CBDC. They don't mean no wholesale CBDC. And what this second tier managed by the private banks is likely to be are things like tokenized deposits, stable coins, things of financial products of that nature. And people will be interacting with that and thinking it's a private sector thing, not necessarily something managed by the federal government or managed by the central bank. But if you are concerned about CBDCs because of the programmability and surveillance aspects, tokenized deposits and bank-issued stablecoins can do all of those things too. You can program them with smart contracts. You can use the same controls on them and surveil them. So the idea that this is any better for financial liberty or for financial privacy is completely mistaken. So you have Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, for example, saying we should be able to seize people's private property for climate change policy related purposes. So is having Jamie Dimon surveil and program your currency better than having the Federal Reserve surveil and program your currency? I mean, I think fundamentally at the end of the day, it's really not that different. I mean, the banks are very willing collaborators with the state surveillance apparatus. Bank of America, for example, after January 6th, gave all of these private financial transactions of account holders to the Department of Justice and the FBI, investigating people who were merely there based on geolocation data in a way that was called out for being fundamentally unconstitutional. So these banks have no problem giving your data away to the federal government when they ask. So the idea that this is a better model than a CBDC, I think, is honestly, a misconception. Prominent central bankers have been going on about the need to create a new financial system and a new financial governance system since at least 2019. So in 2019 at Jackson Hole, Mark Carney, who I believe then was head of the Bank of England, but he's former Goldman Sachs, was very vocal about the need to create this new financial system. And he said this new financial system that needs to be made needs to be based mainly on three things: what he called multipolar currencies, CBDCs, and global carbon markets. That this needed to be where the future financial governance system, the pillars on which it's built, essentially. And a few years later, Mark Carney creates this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero under the auspices of the UN that is partnered with people like BlackRock's Larry Fink, the billionaire Mike Bloomberg, for example. And they openly promote the idea of seizing the new Bretton Woods moment in order to create a new global financial governance system. The crux of their plan hinges on leveraging the multilateral development banking system. So that's the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. It's the World Bank. It's any of these other MDBs, which include like the Inter-American Development Bank, all these development banks around the world that are part of this existing financial governance system. And those banks have been criticized for a long time for using the debt slavery model, essentially, basically giving loans to countries, saddling them with debt, and then they struggle to repay their debt, in the way they're able to get new disbursements or, pay back their debt is related to them enacting policy objectives, often austerity. One thing people don't realize about the digital ID thing too is that there's a push not just to have people have digital ID, but literally everything alive have a digital ID. So Larry Fink talked about this when he recently talked about how he views the tokenization of real world assets moving forward. Everything's going to be on this universal ledger and have its unique identifier. He recently was very overt about how there's going to be a universal ledger where all transactions are tracked, essentially, and that this is key to this new financial system that's being created that involves digital IDs. It also involves global carbon markets and the CBDC digital currency model. All of that is going to be on this centralized database. That's what Fink is saying. And a lot of this new system is tied up with the push for global carbon markets, whereby natural assets, which is a new asset class they're creating, are also going to have these unique identifiers. So for example, there's a lot of efforts right now, for example, to tokenize rainforests for the purpose of using it in this global carbon market. So that rainforest will also be given a unique identifier, a digital ID. So the Rockefeller Foundation and the Inter-American Development Bank, which is part of the multilateral development banking system that includes like the World Bank and the IMF, for example, partnered to create this entity called the Intrinsic Exchange Group, which then partnered with the New York Stock Exchange to launch this new asset class, basically built around what they refer to as natural assets, and create this vehicle for them called natural asset corporations, or NACs. And basically the Intrinsic Exchange Group defined a natural asset as things like ecosystem services that produce clean air, water, that, like how trees turn carbon dioxide into oxygen. All of those services and the parts of the natural world that facilitate those services can be monetized and turn into this new asset class, which they refer to as nature's economy. Essentially, how natural asset corporations work is that they identify the asset that they want to build the natural asset corporation around, and then the natural asset corporation issues shares in that asset out of thin air, essentially. And they can sell it to financial institutions, asset managers, sovereign wealth funds. And then they go public and have an IPO and generate finance that way, and generate funding that way. And that funding is, they say, meant to preserve the natural asset. But elsewhere, they say that their main profit, like so much else, is to generate profit for shareholders. This is like the new Wall Street casino they want to make. It has nothing to do with preserving the environment. That is literally just the talking point they think will stick and sell. We're all in it together. We got to save the planet. So let's allow the bankers to create a new racket that makes the natural world collateral. I mean, that's essentially what's going on here. And so part of the infrastructure of this is to surveil the natural world to ensure that nothing happens to the natural asset. No one is accessing or using these forests, lakes, or rivers that aren't authorized to do so, whether it's by a natural asset corporation or some other financial entity that claims to manage that resource on behalf of the carbon markets. Currently, onboarding to all these systems is slow and very sporadic, and not many people are adopting it. So there needs to be some sort of event that triggers, onboarding at scale. And I think that's what we have to worry about. I think they want to move not just to a cashless society, but a cashless and cardless society. The goal is to have you pay with your face or pay with your biometrics or your palm of your hand. This is already being rolled out at Amazon-owned entities. JP Morgan is piloting it for their customers. And I'm sure at some point, if you don't want to use your biometrics for those purposes, then your bank will be like, sorry, you have to, or, you can't bank with us. A lot of people are hesitant about a CBDC because they see it as centralized government control. And so they're selling it this way. So we, will look at it as, oh, this is coming from the private sector. This is free market innovation and all of this stuff. But people forget that the Wall Street banks time and again have been caught engaging in brazen criminality. These are essentially, they operate as cartels, not as capitalists. And so what we're doing here is entrusting essentially banking cartels to, manage digital dollars and these stable coins and these tokenized deposits that are part of this two-tier CBDC system. And I honestly don't see how people can think that is preferable or any better than a CBDC system where the central bank is directly issuing it. And people also forget that in the United States, the Federal Reserve is owned by the Wall Street banks. So of course, the Wall Street banks don't want to be left out of the new financial system to come. They are going to have it set up so that they have a very important role to play, and their existing business models are allowed to continue into the new era that we're being ushered into.